Morning and
Good
welcome, everyone.
morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. If you don't mind, if you would please put your name and your organization in the chat box so we know who all was here today. We'd appreciate that very much. I'm Ben Bullock with Together SC, and I want to welcome you all to our Talking Together gathering today. We're going to be talking about the American Rescue Plan, which I keep wanting to call the Affordable Rescue Plan in my head, but the American Rescue Plan, and the opportunities for state and local funding and what nonprofits can do to advocate both at the statewide level and at the local level. And so I'm going to turn this over to our Speaking Together coordinator, GP McClear.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And Ben, I think we're going to record this, correct?
Yep.
Okay. I couldn't see the thing. Thank you all. My name is GP McLear. With Together SC, I am their Speaking Together coordinator, working with them on all of their advocacy fronts. I also am the executive director of the South Carolina Arts Alliance, based in Fountain Inn, South Carolina, where I also have the pleasure of serving as their mayor. The best town in America. Sorry to all of you. Today, though, we're going to talk about the American Rescue Plan state and local funds. This is, I think we mentioned this very briefly in our legislative update in March, and this is a follow-up to that. There's been a lot of talk about it and some questions. So we're going to essentially tell you everything we know, some things that we are, I've got an agenda in the presentation, GP. We're going to go through what the American Rescue Plan is, specifically the state and local funding. There's a lot in the ARP, as you'll see, but we're going to focus on state and local funding today. Who's getting money and when they're getting money, what the money can be used for, what Together SC, what we're doing in terms of advocacy for the nonprofit sector within this state and local funding, what you can do, and we're kind of talk about that through the lens of Greenville. And we'll get to that in a second. We've got two great guests, Katie Smith and Catherine Puckett from Greenville Partnership for Philanthropy and the Nonprofit Alliance in Greenville, respectively, who are going to talk about their experience in dealing with county level federal COVID relief funds in the fall. We'll hear from them, and that'll sort of give you guys some ideas on what needs to be done in your community going forward. All right. And if you got any questions, put them in the chat box. I'll try to get to them. I'll be, going through the slides, but I'll try to get to your questions, or I'm sure Ben or Debbie or Katie and Catherine will yell them out if they're really relevant and timely. All right. So first, what is the American Rescue Plan? It became law on March 11th of this year, signed in by the Biden administration. It's the it's the COVID relief package for the Biden administration. It was $1.9 trillion. And it included a lot of things: stimulus checks to all Americans, more PPP loans, unemployment increases, vaccine support, education funding, and a lot more. Kind of a plug real quick for those of you working in the education sphere to keep an eye on ESSER 3 funding. That's a whole other day and a whole other topic, and I hope your education associations are working with that, but that is another almost $3 billion coming through the state. For all districts and the State Department to do some after school learning, summer learning, and learning loss. So just put a pin in that. And then there's also what we're going to talk about today: funding for state and local governments, which had been a priority of some members of Congress. Did I mute myself by accident? I'm sorry. I don't know how I did that. So anyway, I don't know where I was, but we're going to talk about state and local funds. This had been a priority of some members of Congress before this COVID relief package came up, and and now it got in this bill, and so we're going to go through that because it will impact every community in the country. And so who's getting money? Everyone. Every state is getting a minimum of $500 million from this. Every county in America and every city and town in America. So in South Carolina, the state is getting about $2.1 billion under this, and all counties and cities are going to have some share of $1.8 billion. States, counties, and cities, cities with populations over 50,000 will get their money directly from the feds, deposited into their accounts. Cities with less than 50,000 people will get their money from using the state as a pass-through. So the feds will send it to the state, and the state will then send it to cities. That's how the money flows. There's a lot of money out there, and this is happening in every state across the nation. So it's a behemoth. So what does that look like for South Carolina? And I know this will be available, and you can just Google it for the actual links to see what your town has. But the estimates from National League of Cities and also the National Association of Counties. So town of Jenkinsville in Fairfield County, population 56, is getting $16,000. City of Columbia, the largest city in the state, is getting $25.9 million. Greenville County is getting $101 million. And so that's Greenville County, just the county. That does not include Greenville City, does not include Simpsonville, Malden, all the other cities, Fountain Inn in Greenville County. So that's how it works. Every county is getting money, and every city or town within that county is also getting money. And it's pretty much based on population. The exact dollar amounts are still not out there, but these are pretty good estimates that have been compiled. So you should, if you Google it from the National League of Cities or the National Association of Counties, you can find it, or you can kind of take a quick look at those links and type them in. You can look up what your city is getting and your county is getting. And I think some of you may be a little surprised based on the size of your city. I will tell you, for Fountain Inn, we are getting a chunk, and it's interesting to work with. When are we getting it? Treasury has 60 days to disperse funds from the passage of the American Rescue Plan. So we're looking at about mid-May. We're hearing probably around May 11th, obviously. So mid-May, we'll just call it mid-May. States, again, counties and large cities are getting direct payments. Smaller states have 30 days to distribute that money to these smaller cities. The state can ask for an extension, but they have to provide a very legitimate reason for that extension. That is possible. That may happen, but that's going to be up to each individual state. We're not hearing that that's something that our states will do, especially since larger cities are going to get their money anyway. It comes in 2 tranches. 50% comes now. 50% comes no less than 12 months later. So when you're thinking about this funding, it's not just one check for the full amount. There's going to have to be, you're going to have to spend some of it, and then you'll get the rest of it. You don't have to spend all of it in that first year by any means. That first 50%, you don't have to spend it all. But anyway, it is tiered. It comes in two buckets to your city. The deadline to spend the money, or at least appropriate it, we believe, is December 2024. So this is not a short process. This is, in many cases, a long process. And that's something we'll kind of talk about as we get to strategy around advocacy right now. So what's eligible? There are 4 primary uses in the legislation. I will read the first one, and then the other ones I'll just you can see for yourselves. Respond to COVID-19 public health emergency or its negative economic impacts, including assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits, or aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. The other ones include essentially employee hazard pay within government, or grants to eligible employers who have eligible workers. So essentially, you could, in theory, provide healthcare workers with hazard pay through the state and local funding. Lost government revenue. That's a broad term. It's not 100%. There's some nuance to that, but essentially lost government revenue. And then also the bigger one, water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. As you can see, these are pretty broad topics. The intent of this is to use the money. The feds want cities and counties and states to use this money, and they're making it pretty easy to do so based on the uses that you see here. However, this is important to note for this point and for the rest of this presentation. Treasury is responsible for issuing guidance on these, and they have not done so yet. So when you sit here and you think about assistance to nonprofits, okay, well, what does that mean? Is it going to be restricted? Is it going to be COVID only funding? Is it operating? What is it? We don't know. That has not been provided by Treasury. at all. Again, when you also look at water, sewer, broadband infrastructure, which could be a very big pot for a lot of local governments, we don't know what that means exactly. We don't know if that means, can you use it to pay debt? Can you use it for only capital expenses? Does it have to be, projects done during COVID, or is there a period? We don't know. We are waiting for that guidance to hit, and we had hoped that one of the reasons this webinar is scheduled kind of later in April was we were hoping that we would have some very good detail, but that we are hearing that will not be available until about the time the money comes. So they're going to send everyone money and then tell them how to use it, pretty much. So anyway, we're waiting on U.S. Treasury to issue that full guidance, and that will answer a lot of the questions that all of us have, both in the nonprofit sector and on the local government side. I will say, if you are interested in understanding more or keeping an eye out, if you go to the Municipal Association of South Carolina's website, or just Google Municipal Association South Carolina American Rescue Plan, they have a page that has a lot of these big parameters. They are not in any more detail than pretty much what we're providing, but they do have a link for you to actually get an alert from Treasury when things happen. So I've signed up for that, and that's been pretty useful. So you'll be one of the first to know when guidance does hit. That is something you can do, or just follow the Municipal Association and check that page often. The state process. Okay, so here's we're getting into a little bit about what we know. We're not going to give you a lot of what we think may. Oh, we'll talk about what we think may happen, but don't take that at its word. This is what we definitely know. The governor in January proposed $123 million for small business relief in his executive budget proposal, with no mention of nonprofits, and it was directed at the Department of Commerce to administer that money. Nonprofits were not mentioned. They weren't explicitly excluded, but all of the references in his budget proposal were for just small businesses. If you remember the CARES Act process in the fall, there were two buckets of money. There was one explicitly for minority owned and small businesses, and then there was a bucket for nonprofits. So we were a little red flag went up, and we need to make sure that nonprofits are eligible in whatever is proposed. But there was no mention of that in January. It's important to note that there was no ARP at that point either. So this was essentially state funds the governor was proposing to go towards this. There was no relief like that included in the state budget as of right now. Now, the Senate is debating the budget this week. They start at noon today, in case you are interested. So there is no relief in the state budget, but the House and Senate budget committees will use the American Rescue Plan to address that relief and not use state funding. The chairman of House Ways and Means, Merle Smith, stated in the budget hearing, the last budget meeting that the House had, that particular pot of money, the COVID relief packages, would not be funded in the budget, that they wanted to use ARP money since that had become law, and they want to use that. It will follow the typical budget committee process, which is important because that's something that folks understand how to navigate. It's not going to be a special process. It's not the governor administering the funds unilaterally. It does follow the committee process, which means it will have to be adopted by both the House and the Senate ultimately, and then sent to the governor. You also, something good on that front is it follows essentially the same process that CARES Act did. There will be an ad hoc committee and who will propose what to do, and then it'll go through the ranks. So it's a process that people can follow, that people typically can participate in. You can expect Not Together SC to be a part of that. We've already been talking with budget staff and legislators about this. So there is a process to follow. And then the legislature is going to deal with the state budget first, and then turn their attention to the American Rescue Plan, as well as redistricting. There's some we don't know exactly when that will happen. This is another one of those question marks, and a lot of it will probably depend on guidance from Treasury on any sort of firm restrictions put on states. So The state budget, the Senate should be done this week with it. They'll send it to the House. The House will most likely non-concur with it, and they will force into a conference committee to work out their differences and propose a budget. That process could wrap up, in May. It may take till June. They are expected to come back in May for a week after their official end, May 13th. They will come back, we think, for a week, and then they will come back again in June. Most likely to deal with the budget and a couple big ticket legislative items that may still be outstanding. They may throw the ARP in the mix, but the closer and closer it gets to that time, the more it's looking that they will put their state strategy in play in the fall, August, September-ish. So that's what we're hearing from staff. We've heard other things from a couple legislators, but we've heard from staff and reporters and kind of the tide turning towards a fall state rollout. That is just the state process as we know it. This does not impact the process happening at the local level at all, unless you're getting money from the state. But even then, the state has 30 days. They have to give you that money back unless there's some outstanding reason, which I don't foresee a monumental one. So pretty much by mid-June, every state, every city and county and town should have their funds. So again, Together SC's focus is at the state level. So there are over 300 small local governments in South Carolina between counties and cities. It's impossible to develop a strategy that will work in every single one. As you saw, there is broad use of these funds for pretty broad uses. And so getting unilateral guidance to every city and is going to be very difficult. So Together SC's first priority is going to be working at that state level. We're going to push to make sure that there's explicit nonprofit eligibility. That's sort of like the baseline. If there's just a big bucket of COVID relief for small businesses, well, nonprofits are businesses too. They should have access to that relief. And of course, nonprofit only funding, because of the nuance of how nonprofits operate their business model and different terms that are used. Some of the language used in the small business relief program in the fall, for instance, would not apply to nonprofits. So there's some nuance there we want to work on. Policy and process is kind of what I was talking about. We want nonprofit friendly language in the applications and the reporting. We've learned some lessons from the CARES Act grant process. The Together SC has actually worked with the Department of Administration, who did the CARES Act grant before, during, and after, to sort of take some lessons back and understand how the state approached things. So we've learned a lot from that process. And then we will also advise on legislative language around any program. As we learned in CARES Act, what's in the law really matters. That's what they lean on. So we want to make sure that it is nonprofit friendly. We also are kind of looking at some partnerships. We've been in contact with folks from the Municipal Association and the Department of Commerce. The Municipal Association, we are hopefully going to work with them on providing some sort of framework of why nonprofits are eligible, or how nonprofits are eligible, why they can be supported and should be supported by local governments, and some general rules of thumb when working with nonprofits and granting those funds out, and some recommendations that we're hoping they have available to all cities. So that's a good way of us not really saying, hey, every city county, this is what you need to do, and kind of working with every mayor across the state. But it is a way of us to give the associations some guidance in case they get questions about how to use their funding. And the Department of Commerce is another entity that we've been communicating with and trying to work with on if they happen to be the entity that receives this money, making sure that we have a partnership starting with them. So that's what we're doing at the state level in this moment, and that's what we will continue to do. We do have some really good. I think we've had some good conversations already. We've got some good partners that we're working with, and I think we've got a strategy that will work. At some point, there will probably be, just to put a bug in your ear, a sign-on letter for all Together SC members at some point, once the timing is right, for us to send to the legislature and the governor about, we want nonprofit access to COVID relief funds. The other big tool that we have, and I should have put a bullet on this to remind myself to talk about it a little earlier, but is the spring survey from Together SC of nonprofits. That data in particular has been really useful to get a message across about what about the need in the nonprofit community. And we'll be leaning on that data to frame our ask and to back our request. And in fact, you will probably see an alert go out if you're getting our Speaking Together newsletter, which is our advocacy newsletter, a link to kind of start laying some of the groundwork with legislators by contacting them with some pretty our initial sort of, hey, nonprofits are here. As you look at the ARP, think about nonprofits. So be on the lookout for that. One note I wanted to put here to kind of, as I transition to some local stuff, is states cannot place additional requirements on cities and counties. So states can't say, the state can't say you can only put X percentage in for nonprofits or in sewer or what have you. Now, the U.S. Treasury may say something. We don't know yet, but the state cannot place that additional restriction. So the good news for nonprofits there is one of the issues we had with the CARES Act funding is that if you got previous support, you were less likely to get funding in the state CARES Act grant. Unless that guidance comes from Treasury that is similar, the state can't place that restriction on cities. The state can't say, hey, cities, if a nonprofit gets money from us this time, you can't let them get money from you. So that sort of eliminates that concern at the state level. Still could exist in your city. Your city may say, if you got money somewhere else, you can't get it here. And that's going to be a local advocacy push you'll have to weigh. But at least at the state level, some of the additional requirements cannot be placed on the cities and counties. The cities and counties will have to issue periodic reports to the federal government, not to their state government. So pretty much the state is just the pass-through for this money. Things that you can do. So like I said, with over 300 local governments in the state, we're going to be leaning a lot on local advocates to advance nonprofits at the city and county level. These are going to be based on local relationships that you have with elected officials, with coalitions you can build. And again, cities and counties will have their money sometime between mid-May and the end of June, mid-June, I believe. That is also coincides with every local government's budget year, pretty much, almost all of them. So it's important to start taking action now in your local government. These are kind of our three basic things, and then we're going to turn it over to Katie and Catherine to provide some put this into real life context for you. But three things that kind of basic. Raise your hand now. Let local governments know that A, nonprofits are eligible. B, they should be supported. And C, here we are. That's important to do. Find some partners. We've found that, and you'll hear from Greenville, going at it alone is difficult. Having a coalition of nonprofits is a really good way to go because it's going to benefit everybody. And then also make sure you're connected with local leaders. If you haven't met your city council members yet or your town council members yet, do that. If you don't know your county council members, start reaching out. They're thinking about it. I promise you, I guarantee you, because I know we're thinking about it. How are we going to spend this kind of money on these four uses in a way that is responsible, in a way that is transparent, and in a way that will benefit the community? So the local governments are thinking about it a lot. And so some of them are already coming up with some general plans, and then barring any guidance from U.S. Treasury, they will continue those or alter those plans. I know we've got a couple things we're looking at already. So it's important to do these three things right now and start thinking about how this can benefit your community. So I'm going to introduce Katie and Catherine in the next slide. But Greenville, why we're talking about Greenville. Greenville was the only county to receive its own CARES Act allocation in the fall. Counties with populations over a certain threshold got direct payments from the CARES Act, and Greenville County is the only one with that population level in the state. So they They were the only one in the state to get it. The coalition of nonprofits worked on securing 2 rounds of grants for nonprofits within that county allocation. And so they've got it's a very similar process to what the ARP is going to be across the state. And so since they're the only ones who've gone through it, we wanted to hear from them. And we've got some great lessons learned that they've put together. Unless there's any sort of pressing questions that anyone has at this time, or we can wait till the end probably. Let's give Katie and Catherine enough time. Katie Smith is with the Greenville Partnership for Philanthropy and Piedmont Health Foundation. And Catherine Puckett is with the Nonprofit Alliance in Greenville. Katie and Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can just tell me when to go to the next slide.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, GP. So I'm doing the first slide, and I'll just want to say as a preface that it's been such a treat to work with Together SC and Greenville Partnership for Philanthropy. We're also members of South Carolina Grantmakers Network and have been delighted to partner with them in this work. Let me say also that I am presenting solely as a representative of Greenville Partnership for Philanthropy today. For those of you in Greenville who know that I have 2 jobs. Piedmont Health Foundation, while a great organization, is totally prohibited from any lobbying. And so all the work that I did, most of which was advocacy and not lobbying, was under the work with GPP. So just wanted to put my little disclaimer out there. So GP, if you could go to the next slide, our first lesson. So our first lesson is just to see the opportunity. Many of you on the screen, I know, are super seasoned advocates. And were engaged in this work the last time around. So hopefully you can find some lessons for yourself, regardless if you're really knowledgeable. But in Greenville, March 27th, CARES Act passed, which we all knew. We all knew about the PPP. We all knew about the checks to individuals. We gradually became aware that there were lots of tranches of funds coming in through different state programs. But it was like mid-April that I got a phone call from a former board member who said, do you know that the county just got $91 million transferred in 2 payments from Treasury into its account, which was about half of our annual budget in Greenville County. And first I was like, no, that didn't happen. I haven't heard anything about that. And once determined, yeah, that was actually true. He said, you, and I don't know if he meant like me personally or GPP, you need to go ask for some. So I thought, okay. So Catherine with NPA and I got together with a lot of folks and said, like, what does this mean? And he emphasized the county is not used to doing something like this. They don't really have a plan. They don't know much about it. You guys need to come up with a plan for it and see the opportunity here. So we could have said, we are really tired. We are trying to figure out how to help people apply for PPP, but we said, no, okay, let's try it. Let's claim this opportunity. So that's our first lesson, which you being on this little webinar here indicates you already see that. Next slide, please, GP. So our next lesson for you, or for us, that we would share with you is to be the expert on the topic. And this is best practice in advocacy anyway, because all of you guys are experts in whatever you do. If you run an arts organization, you know the change in arts, arts can make in someone's life. If you provide housing to folks, you know the difference that can make. You know what implications on your budget COVID has had. But in this particular sense, we started researching the heck out of the CARES Act to understand specifically what was the Coronavirus Relief Fund and what was allowable and not allowable. And then more generally, what were all these lines of funding coming into the state? We partnered with Naomi Lett at United Way Association of South Carolina. Some of you guys probably participated in a webinar with us last year where we went slide by slide about all the funds coming in. We wanted to be the most knowledgeable in our community that we could be, so that we could be a resource for our county as they were thinking through what to do, and so that we could knowledgeably ask for things on behalf of the nonprofit sector. So that we could be an expert was really helpful in this. So we would just emphasize for you all to do that through continuing your education through things like this. Next slide, please, GP. This is so important and so specific to whatever geography you work in, is understanding the political landscape. The context of who were the ultimate decision makers around the coronavirus relief funds influenced our whole strategy. So we knew that the ultimate decision-making body was our Greenville County Council. In Greenville County, we have 12 county council members that are single member districts. So they each represent a super particular geography of our county. Some conduct their job in that way. They might be just thinking about Greer and its surrounding area. Some do think about the whole county in their decision making, and they split in some little factions, as often happens in political bodies. It tended to be before the elections, we had like 4 that voted here, 4 that voted here, and then 4 in the middle that would kind of go back and forth. So we knew, all right, there are certain members within this that we need to target our message to. And then very specifically, we know what kind of message plays in Greenville County. Some of our council members were not really believing that COVID was a thing. If it was a thing, they weren't really sure whether it was as important to pay attention to the health implications versus the economic implications. And the economy and economic development is always one of the most important messages in Greenville County, as it is in much of South Carolina. So we knew that was the political context that we were operating in, the area we needed to influence, and how we crafted our strategy. So our advice to you as you think about your own strategy is to take a look at who your decision makers are in your city or in your county. Understand what motivates them and who influences them in making their decisions. So I'm going to pass it over to Catherine for the next set of lessons.
Thanks, Katie. So our next lesson would be create the coalition. Now that we had the knowledge of what we were fighting for and also understood where the decision makers were coming for, what their motivations were, we needed to create a coalition. Certainly the best work is done in cooperation like this. So we assembled a sort of a task force that included nonprofit leaders and leaders from the philanthropic community as well. And then we also asked some local advocacy allies to join us just to understand their perspective and get their expertise. So as our coalition kind of grew, as we honed in our requests, we asked more people to join to get more areas of expertise, and to also ask some people who were directly influential on these decision makers. It was really valuable to get that outside work or advocacy expertise to come in. And we also knew that we needed to turn out a lot of calls and a lot of emails to the county council to make sure they understood we meant business and that we're really interested in this. We hosted a webinar, and during the webinar, we invited all the nonprofit and philanthropic leaders in Greenville County to come together, and we encouraged them to act. We created consistent messaging, so there was never a question as to what we were asking for. And we tracked those emails and calls. We asked the people who contacted the county council members to let us know that they did contact them and what their responses were from the county council members. Knowing these were the ones making the decisions, we wanted to understand their feelings on our ask, as well as their motivations on how they wanted it spent. And also, what was really interesting is during this time, we realized this was really the first time a lot of the nonprofit leaders had engaged in this local advocacy work. So it was really interesting. The next thing that we did was to create the ask. So with all that we've gathered and with all the people working together, we knew we wanted to create an ask that was very succinct and also reliable and very simple. Okay, I just got a message that my internet is being unstable, so flag me down if I need to stop. Okay, we needed to be simple and so that it would be communicated very well, but we also wanted to make sure it was in a language that our county council, it would resonate with them. They would understand it and appreciate it. And during that ask, we not only included what we wanted, but also the needs of others that we knew were important for Greenville County. So we included the small businesses that were, like Katie mentioned, was a really important part for our county council to be included. So the advice that we would give you about this is to create and to be inclusive and to be representative, and then also an ask that includes what you want, but in a framework and a language that would resonate with the decision makers. So the next slide, we'll turn to Katie.
I'm going to pop in the chat.
Katie, you went on mute.
Thank you. I popped in the chat our ask, although don't leave us. You can look at it later. It just shows the way we crafted it, which was relevant for our context. It was an acronym because who doesn't love an acronym? So you can take a look at that later. So our next lesson is to make the first move. We gathered as we continued our work that there was not going to be a time in which our input was solicited or that a proposal was going to be shared with us as a draft to consider by the county. So we knew we needed to make our ask known. So we began sharing it with some council members who were friends to kind of get their feedback, with some that were in the middle to see what messages seemed to resonate with them, with other allies as they were joining the coalition, like the chamber, as Catherine mentioned. And then it was shared with the Greenville News. It was put out there as like, here's a bar that we are hoping will be met. So it was the kind of measuring stick against which future county action could be compared. So really specifically, we had requests for funding to support individuals, funding to support nonprofits, funding to support businesses. When the county came out with what we think we're going to do, they had 75 million out of our 91 million for small business. Of course, we firmly believe small business is important because a lot of people work for small business and that's how they pay their light bill. But that was very different from what we hoped would happen to include nonprofits. So this was it started the conversation so that in subsequent Greenville News articles, they would say, this is different from the Open for Business plan. So our advice to you is that you make the first move and kind of put out there what you're hoping to see. And this is exactly what GP just talked about with the state activity that Together SC will champion. It doesn't have to be dollar amounts. I mean, it could be, we hope there'll be 500,000 out of our city's 1.5 million for nonprofits, but it could also be, we expect to have transparency in this process. We hope you'll set up a committee that is multi-sector. Make your expectations known early and so that it's something to compare against. I hand it back over to Catherine.
And the next lesson we learned was to be consistent. So during all of this time, we were not getting great accolades and saying, great job, we definitely want your plan, but we stood the course and we did not back down from our message. So as the feedback kept coming out in different proposals that we realized it was not like Katie was not what we wanted, but we kept our message consistent and we communicated this regularly. So what happened next was after we had met with the county council members and the media, we had dozens of calls go out, and then we were given 24 hours notice that on a Friday afternoon in June, the county council was going to meet to vote on this. The vote came back and it did not represent our interests like we had hoped. We were certainly very frustrated and we were very disappointed, but we did not give up. We knew that this was a long game and that's what we were playing, was a long game. During this time, the chamber was very satisfied with what came out of that vote and their objectives were met, but we kept going. We kept meeting with the county council members and telling our stories. And during this time, we maintained a really positive relationship with the county council members, but also the staff of county. And that really helped us. They were even invited to come on to a few of our meetings to speak to nonprofit and philanthropic leaders. At every step along the way, we thanked our supporters. We thanked those making phone calls and sending the emails, and we thanked our advocates, and then we thanked the ones on county council to listen to us, and we kept it positive the whole time, and that is definitely some advice that we continue to get. So finally, by the end of the year, we felt like that we had our win. Eventually, millions went to nonprofit organizations in Greenville County. It funded projects that the nonprofits wanted to undertake that could be attributed to the COVID prevention and then it helped with food, utilities, rent, mortgage, childcare, and more. The county's response wasn't what we originally asked for, but in the end, the nonprofits did receive the assistance so they can continue their great work with the community, and community members received the help with the economic impacts that COVID brought. So in other words, this was a win for us. We were very happy about this, and we were glad to do it. The other win, which may even be a bigger long-time win, is really the engagement that we saw in Greenville County. I mentioned a lot of people, this was their first time really participating at this level, and they saw through this that there's a lot of passion, and also that their efforts did not go unfulfilled. We really got some great feedback and have great relationships with the county council and staff. So that to us is a wonderful win.
I'll add from that long game, from a philanthropic perspective, we've always talked in the abstract about how government dollars are far larger and can go much farther than philanthropic dollars can. But we practically saw it last year when lots of local funders had made more unrestricted emergency grants available. That's super if one of them can do that, like at 100,000 or 200,000. But having 91 million on the table, that makes funders realize, oh, this maximizes my impact too. So we got involved in a new way, and that was really important. So GP, for our last slide, here's a summation of what we learned. What I would just say to you all is get involved in whatever way makes sense in your community, in your political context, and with your bandwidth, and really stick with it. If you are a statewide organization, you probably have a lot of this wherewithal already, but Together SC can help lead the charge on behalf of nonprofits. If you're a local organization, you have those relationships, and those relationships are fundamental to advocacy. That's what advocacy is. So while there were times when we were very frustrated with the county, and I'm sure they were very frustrated with us, it really ended well. And we have a great relationship and are so appreciative of county staff for the way that they worked with us. And we look forward to continuing to build on that. We've been in touch with them about this year and what happens next, and have an open dialogue. So we'll continue to work on that for all my Greenville friends on the phone in this next line of funding. So hope you guys get engaged and pay dividends, and hope you have a good win, however you define it, wherever you're located. I guess I'm happy to take any questions. GP, turn it back over to you.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is we've got some time for some questions. Katie and Catherine did a great job covering Greenville. One lesson that we learned in the Together SC survey is that you'll see it in our requests, that this public support that Katie mentioned that was so much bigger than what the philanthropic sector was thinking has been, it worked. A nonprofit survey in October of last year, it was almost 2/3 of nonprofits only had 6 months of operating cash left. In the spring survey, the number was 60% for 6 more months. So that 6-month timeline, moved. So now instead of in October, 6 months plus 6, it's now March plus 6 months. So you're looking at by June, but the need is still there. But that government support and these nonprofit relief grants worked. They lengthened the runway for nonprofits to operate in this state. And so the justification for ARP funding for nonprofits, not only is it explicitly eligible and in many ways highly suggested because it is listed, but it is also well worth the investment to keep nonprofit businesses open and bringing jobs back because we know there has been job loss in the nonprofit sector too. So thank you, Katie and Catherine. If there's any questions or anything, please throw them in the chat or I guess shout it out too. And that's dangerous in a large Zoom like this, but you can try. We'll kind of pause for some questions, or Ben, or if you have any comments from Together SC side. But
I just want to say thank you to Catherine and Katie for sharing with us their lessons learned from Greenville County. While I think we wish we had the sort of every county and city got funding in the first round, the way it's happening in the second round, I think it's great that we've got some lessons learned in the trial run in Greenville that we can take to this second go round. So thank y'all for sharing that with us. And so I see a question from Susan Devaney here. Do you all see any other states that have been successful with nonprofit funding from federal relief efforts? I think I'll try and answer this one because we're a part of the National Council of Nonprofits, and that is the national network of organizations like Together SC, and we get together and we have email conversations and talk about things like this and others. And what I have learned from that is that the process in each state, the last go round, was just very different and so very dependent on what state agency had responsibility for distributing the funds, and what the political landscape was. The processes varied wildly. Some states had a much easier and simpler process than we did, and some states had a much more complicated and tortuous process than we did. And so I think the lesson we learned from that was it really matters who is responsible for distributing the funds and what additional requirements they set on it. So that's going to be, I think, part of our focus. GP may correct me if I've misspoken, is to really advocate on who's going to be responsible for distributing the funds.
Yeah, it's been different every state, and it was interesting to watch different states interpret the CARES Act differently. South Carolina leaned on a firm called Guidehouse to provide all of their guidance in relation to distributing CARES Act funds, not just in grants, but across the board. And so Guidehouse had a very strong hold on what the language meant, both federal language and also what the state legislation that governed CARES Act meant. So the process and the language really matters. We believe that the ARP language will be a little bit more flexible. Again, this administration wants this money spent. And so that's, I think, the short answer. It's a longer answer to your question, Susan, but the short answer is yes. I think there were successful efforts for nonprofit funding, and really it was the amount and the expediency of which just varied drastically depending on the political landscape of a certain state. But going forward, just so you guys know, when full guidance is issued, I would be sure this will be a part of For Good Connections, which goes out every other week from Together SC, but we will have a deeper dive in it for our Speaking Together newsletter, which is for those organizations interested in advocacy. And so, and if you don't have that, Ben, I don't know if you have the ability to throw that in the chat, or at least we can maybe put it as part of the post. We'll put it in the post webinar email to sign up for that. We'll have a little bit of a deeper dive on that, and just for folks to kind of, you can take that to your cities and towns. Katie had a question. Since replacement revenues for localities and infrastructure projects are eligible, what do you think around messaging by local nonprofits for their needs? I think those are two really big items. I will say, Katie, I'm finding that most cities, with the exception of those who lean heavily on the hospitality industry, their revenues in South Carolina have been okay. If you are heavily reliant on hospitality and tourism, you obviously got hit very hard in your city budget. For other cities, they may not. That replacement revenue may be a little harder to justify. We don't know. The language on that is actually pretty loose too. So I don't know about that one, but the infrastructure one is a big pot, because regardless of what the language is, there's some eligible use for infrastructure, whether it's sewer, water, or broadband. So that's a highly competitive process. I would hope that Treasury says you can't spend 100% in one bucket. And I think that's the baseline request for your local government. Don't spend all of it in one spot. There are a lot of needs. I know for our city, there are some staff members who we really wish we could give hazard pay to based on their role in the community, and they deserve that pay for working extra. We have infrastructure needs, but we also have some great nonprofits that have struggled through COVID, and they need to be supported. And that's sort of the approach we're taking, is so advocating for diversified approach that is inclusive of nonprofit support is a way to do that. And that would be my input. If your local government already provides some sort of grant making process, if you are more arts and culture or tourism related, your H&A tax grant process that probably went down the drain this year, those are existing grant applications. Those are existing grantees and an existing infrastructure by which they are used to delivering funds to nonprofits. That's a pretty good area to sort of start a conversation about. Those are nonprofits that are benefiting from that money. They obviously took a hit, and they need support. And lastly, talking about the impact of COVID. I mean, that's pretty cut and dry. If you saw an increase in services, especially those in health and human service areas, we saw a large increase in need, food banks, for instance, then that you've got extra cost and you want to meet. If you've got on the flip side, arts and culture, you've been closed for a year. And in order to turn the economies back on, you're going to need every Main Street's back on in full. You're going to need every sector operating at full steam. And this would help lengthen that runway for nonprofits to get to the place where they are able to operate in a revenue generating way. So that's that's my pitch. And again, some local nuance and flair to that will help as well. But Ben, if there's no other questions, I think it's up to you.
Yep, I think I'll give folks just another moment to in case any emergency questions pop up in their heads. So I'll stall for time for a second and say that we will send a follow-up email out later this afternoon, hopefully, with this presentation, a link to the recording, as well as a link to the process on how you would sign up for Good Connections and for our Speaking Together newsletter, so you can be in the know about our advocacy activities and how you can connect with us and with each other. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again to Catherine and Katie and GP for all their work on this. And I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And if Together SC can be of any help to you in helping plot your advocacy work, just let us know.